in hospital, so she's with us in spirit. The Shaw Society was formed in 1941, and during the time when Shaw was still very much alive, and he wasn't very keen on the idea, so I thought I would just read the letter that he wrote us at the time. The Browning Society was a terror to Browning. Shelley was dead. Shakespeare was dead. I shall soon be dead. We all provided a rallying point for the cooperation and education of kindred spirits, and a forum for their irreconcilable controversies. So go ahead, but don't bother me about it. I'm old, deaf and dotty. In short, a has-been. But anyway, he let us go ahead. 80 years later, we're still
No accident. Oh, thank you. Centre stage as ever. No accident that we've decided to start off here, because the great man himself did actually live in the top 2 floors of this building, which is incredible. And you think, my goodness, I couldn't even afford a cupboard in Fitzroy Square, far less top 2 floors of a building. So this is the first piece which I'm going to read, and it's from our Shaw, Mrs. Shaw herself, which looks at the romance and the love affair, the courtship of George Bernard Shaw and Charlotte Payne Townsend. And this is written because of where he was living and the kind of conditions he was living in. And although I don't talk about this today, apparently the room that he worked in was so cluttered with huge big furniture that people had to kind of walk crab-like to actually get anywhere round the room. So I shan't do this piece in crab-like fashion, but it is from the show. He worked in a very small room, which was in a perpetual state of dirt and disorder. The mass of matter on the table was chaotic. Heaps of books, piles of manuscripts, letters, envelopes, butter, sugar, apples, knives, forks, spoons, sometimes a cup of cocoa or a half-finished plate of porridge, a saucepan and a dozen other things, and all undusted because his papers must not be touched. And that was very I shall remove crab knife.
Well, I'm a teacher and musician. I came to Shaw long before we started doing Mrs. Shaw herself through reading the music criticism or excerpts of it, which is hilarious. Anyway, this is from the preface to London Music, and it's about Shaw's childhood. We children, I had 2 sisters older than myself and no brothers, were abandoned entirely to the servants, who, with the exception of Nurse Williams, who was a good and honest woman, were utterly unfit to be trusted with the charge of 3 cats, much less 3 children. I had my meals in the kitchen, mostly of stewed beef, which I loathed, badly cooked potatoes, sound or diseased as the case might be, and much too much tea out of brown Delft teapots left to draw on the hob until it was pure tannin. Sugar I stole. I was never hungry because my father, often insufficiently fed in his childhood, had such a horror of child hunger that he insisted on unlimited bread and butter being always within our reach. When I was troublesome, a servant thumped me on the head, until one day, greatly daring, I rebelled, and, on finding her collapse abjectly, became thenceforth uncontrollable. I hated the servants, and like my mother, because, on the 1 or 2 rare and delightful occasions when she buttered my bread for me, she buttered it quickly, instead of merely wiping a knife on it. Her almost complete neglect of me had the advantage that I could idolise her to the utmost pitch of my imagination, and had no sordid or disillusioning contacts with her. It was a privilege to be taken for a walk or a visit with her, or on an excursion. And my ordinary exercise, whilst I was still too young to be allowed out by myself, was to be taken out by a servant who was supposed to air me on the banks of the canal or round the fashionable squares where the atmosphere was esteemed salubrious and the surroundings gentlemanly. Actually, she took me into the slums to visit her private friends who dwelt in squalid tenements. And when she met a generous male acquaintance who insisted on treating her, she took me into the public house bars, where I was regaled with lemonade and ginger beer. But I did not enjoy these treats because my father's eloquence on the evil of drink had given me an impression that a public house was a wicked place into which I should not have been taken. And thus were laid the foundations of my lifelong hatred of poverty and the devotion of all my public life to the task of exterminating the poor and rendering their resurrection forever impossible. Note, by the way, that I should have been much more decently brought up if my parents had been too poor to afford servants.
So I'm going to sort of turn the tables and comment on Shaw through the words of Max Beerbaum. And if you're just kind of perhaps scrolling down your database of eminent Victorians and aren't quite sure, when you get to be, Beerbaum famously was caricaturist, satirist, critic, but by his own admission, his greatest skills were his ability to tie a most beautiful knot on his cravat and to take the right cologne for every occasion. So, needless to say, a man embedded so solidly in the kind of pathetic and the dandiacal didn't actually take to Shaw. And when he first met him, he said, Shaw has the power to infect almost everyone with the delight that he takes in himself. As a caricaturist, he was imposed upon to draw Shaw, and he really didn't want to. He thought he wasn't a suitable subject. He said, the pallid, pitted skin, the red hair like curling seaweed, the back of his neck especially bleak, long, untenanted, and deadly white. Whether Shaw ever knew that this was his sentiment, we don't know apparently, but certainly if he did, he didn't take it against him, because in 1896, as I'm sure you know, Shaw resigned as the theatre critic from the Saturday Review, and the then editor, Frank Harris, asked Shaw who was going to take over. And Shaw very generously said, it's the incomparable Max Beerbaum should do it. So Frank Harris contacted Beerbaum, said, you have been recommended, would you care to have the job? And rather quizzically, he received a reply from Beerbaum saying, well, how much did you pay Bernard Shaw? So Frank Harris replies, Beerbaum receives the notification of the sum, then writes back, and to Harris's absolute astoundment, he asked for considerably more than Shaw had been receiving. And Harris writes to Beerbaum saying, you young whippersnapper, how could you ask for more than the great Shaw? And Max replied, Shaw knows so much more. I will have to think twice as long and work twice as hard to produce anything comparable. It is therefore only fair that I should receive twice the salary. Now, I'm sure that Shaw would have accepted that sentiment, but whether he would have accepted that striped proto-Thatcherite economics, I leave to you, Shane.
Well, first of all, what attracts me to Shaw and keeps me attracted to Shaw is his politics, rather than his wit and his plays, which I do love, but it's his politics. And when I was told domesticity, I thought, my God, it's not my long suit. I'm happily divorced. Domesticity. But I thought genteel poverty, he had to think about poverty. So I've written a sort of a Shavian speechette about poverty. Okay, so I will be Shaw. First of all, can I thank you for accepting the invitation to be here on my first crawl? I hope there'll be many more. I'm sure you get lots of invitations. I had one. Some of them have almost a tone of a military command about them. This one said, Sir Richard and Lady Olivia Pullman, not request the pleasure of your company, or will be delighted to meet you. No, we'll be at home from 4 p.m. on Sunday, April. I replied, so will Mr. Shaw. But I wanted to talk about poverty. Now, I've said about poverty, slightly tongue-in-cheek, that the matter with the poor is poverty, the matter with the rich is uselessness. I'll leave the rich out of this for a moment and deal with the poor and poverty. Now, what is poverty? I mean, some people regard it as purely a sociological phenomenon, even an unfortunate byproduct of our economic system. I will argue that it is an essential ingredient of our economic system and discuss what it is we need to do about that. Now, there are those who say, well, it's a question of virtue. Riches is the reward for virtue. Poverty is a reward for lack of virtue. It's almost like a sin. And I will accept, for the sake of argument at least, that there are certain characteristics and behaviours that will cause a person to be poor. I'm thinking of laziness, work shyness, slovenliness, drunkenness, debauchery, gambling. But you know, in my experience, I found these characteristics displayed more often by the very rich than I ever have done by the very poor. And even if they were their own fault, even if it was their own fault that they were poor, surely their children are not to blame for anything. The man or woman who is born poor will never get the chill of poverty out of their bones. And no matter how much they strive, and some of them will escape this poverty, but they will be fearful, even if they've escaped it, of being thrown back into that arbitrary position that they were so arbitrarily allocated in the first place. What a waste of human life. I thought we need to do something about it. You know, we tell our fellow citizens, if you want money, you must go out and earn it. Yet we support a system which requires that there be an army of the unemployed. This allows flexibility in the labour supply. The only purpose of this is to reduce the value of the worker's labour, with the result that even in work, the labourer and his family will remain poor. Out of work, they will become destitute. And poverty is a crime, and it is a crime committed not by those who are poor, but by those who support a system which insists they must remain poor. Now, what to do? What to do about it? I don't think we could just tinker with the system. You know, it is fundamentally there. It is a requirement of the system. It is an active ingredient. It needs to be there. What we need to do is put a bomb under the system. We need to start again. We need to think in terms of pensions for life for all, and that everyone should earn their pensions, redistribution of wealth, equalising income. These are the things that we need to think of. Sir, you look at me as if I'm mad. Can I just tell you, all great truths begin as blasphemy.
And that's why I look at you if you're mad.
Well, you seem like a reasonable woman, and you, sir, a reasonable man. Now, a reasonable man or woman will look at society and say, how do I fit in? How do I get on with the way things are? Where it is the unreasonable man or woman who will say, I don't like the way this is. I want to change this to suit my own ideas. Therefore, all social progress depends on unreasonable men and women. And I can tell you, I am the most unreasonable of men. And I will be speaking further on issues like freedom of the press and freedom of speech when we get to Red Lion Square later. Thank you very much.
Can I take a photo of you taking a photo? Yeah. A mass group photo. Well, I've got my homework to write this down. So, yeah. So nice to meet you. Where do you come from originally though? Ah, right, yeah. It's nice you to join us.
We'll get soaked outside.
Well, here we are making our way to a pub. As an actor, I'm delighted. As show, I'd be scandalised. But there will be non-alcoholic.
Just Alexis to go to the toilet,
Next to this, Mr. Smith, I call him Mr. Smith, it's not his real name, but I made a successful effort to delete his name from my memory. And he talked all the time about himself. Yeah, it was his main topic.
Must have been an actor.
His wonderful qualities, his magnificent achievements, and most of all his encyclopedic knowledge. At one point he had to pause for breath. So seizing my chance, I said, "Do you know, Mr. Smith, an extraordinary thought has just occurred to me." "Oh, Mr. Shaw, what do you mean?" Did I mention he was English? "What do you mean, Mr. Shaw?" He said, "Well, it's just occurred to me that between us, we know everything there is to be known in the world." "Really, Mr. Shaw, how did you come to such a conclusion?" "Well," he said, "from listening to you, it's clear that you know everything there is to be known in the world. Apart from the fact that you're a crashing bore, and I know that, tune in." And I spent the rest of the time talking to the delicious woman on my left.
Cheerful.
Here we are outside the Ethical Society. You've done all that bit, haven't you?
No, I haven't.
All right. Ethical Society as was. Shaw moaned in a very funny letter about grumbled about having to pay a subscription, but he was in there from the start, and it's a great place. And it would have been lovely to have gone in the library where they've got lots of photos and things, but it's all shut up today. Shut up. Anyway, Brian, thank you for coming up all the way from Chichester. Round of applause, please.
I offered to do this because it seemed to me topical, as of course Shaw so often was, and it's from his piece Common Sense About the War. He spent his 58th birthday at the Fabian Summer School, which he did most years, where he learnt, as you all know, to ride a bicycle, and spent a lot of time mending female bicycle tyres. He rode very well apparently, but he had a rather individual way of stopping, which was steering into any convenient hedge or bush, and sometimes a tree, and resulting in several bruises and injuries along the way. But anyway, along came the 1914 war. Pygmalion closed just before, and the time had come for him to pluck up courage and do some serious thinking and talking about the war. And he took himself off to the Hydro Hotel in Torquay and penned Common Sense About the War, which was printed as a supplement in the New Statesman, owned of course by Sidney and Beatrice Webb, with Shaw as a major shareholder. And in it he accused the generals and the politicians of being unable to think further ahead than the length of a bayonet. We should all be demanding of our governments what it is exactly that we are fighting about. And how do we know when it's over? How do we know what constitutes a victory? How much death and destruction constitutes a victory? Would we not be better off even now, preparing for a peace which must come eventually, and for a peace which will not sow such seeds of resentment in the vanquished that future conflict becomes inevitable? For the second time in my life, I was faced with abuse, condemnation, talks of treachery. Old friends avoided me. Bookshops and libraries cleared my works from their shelves. Newspaper editors told their readers to boycott my plays. Henry James accused me of descending into the arena and playing the clown. Why is it that none of our present crop of leaders seem able to see as far as I see? George Bernard Shaw on war. And I kind of feel like saying exactly the same things today, word for word.
Oh yeah, when I tell people about this, they always say, I didn't know Karl Marx wrote poetry, because I've just published a chapbook for ARC Publications of Karl Marx's poetry. Because Marx, when he was an undergraduate, had ambitions to become a man of letters, and he wrote a novel, and he wrote a play, and he wrote about 140 poems, many of which are poems to his future wife, Jenny von Westphalen, some of which are political satires, and some of which are just written in the romantic spirit of the day. Marx being a great admirer of the German poet Heinrich Heine, whom he would later befriend when they were both living in Paris. So yes, that's my latest publication. And incidentally, next year keep a lookout for my next publication, which is the poetry of the French philosopher Simone Weil. And people always say to me, I didn't know Simone Weil wrote poetry. Well, anyway, my name's Philip, and I teach at the University of East Anglia, and I teach philosophy. And I also teach translation studies. Now, the founding figure of Western philosophy, stress the Western, is usually claimed to be the Greek philosopher Socrates, who never actually wrote anything, but a lot of his thoughts have come down to us, mostly through the work of Plato. So Socrates, the founder of Western philosophy. It's very interesting to put Socrates into dialogue with other philosophers and with other historical figures. For example, one of our PhD students at the moment is just finishing a doctoral dissertation on Socrates and Wittgenstein. You know, what do they have in common, what do they have apart, etc. And when Helen said, well, you know, would you be interested in reading about this, I thought, well, yes, I'd love to kind of do some of my favourite play, which is St. Joan. And I came across this where Shaw actually puts together, believe it or not, and I think it's a really interesting comparison, Joan and Socrates. And he has this to say: if Joan had been malicious, selfish, cowardly or stupid, she would have been one of the most odious persons known to history, instead of one of the most attractive. If she had been old enough to know the effect she was producing on the men whom she humiliated by being right when they were wrong, and had learnt to flatter and manage them, she might have lived as long as Queen Elizabeth. But she was too young and rustical and inexperienced to have any such arts. When she was thwarted by men whom she thought fools, she made no secret of her opinion of them, or her impatience with their folly. And she was naive enough to expect them to be obliged to her for setting them right and keeping them out of mischief. Now, it is always hard for superior wits to understand the fury roused by their exposures of the stupidities of comparative dullards. Even Socrates, for all his age and experience, did not defend himself at his trial like a man who understood the long accumulated fury that had burst upon him and was clamouring for his death. His accuser, if born 2,300 years later, might have been picked out of any first-class carriage on a suburban railway during the evening or morning rush from or to the city. For he had really nothing to say except that he and his like could not endure being shown up as idiots every time Socrates opened his mouth. Socrates, unconscious of this, was paralysed by his sense that somehow he was missing the point of the attack. He petered out after he had established the fact that he was an old soldier and a man of honourable life, and his accuser was a silly snob. He had no suspicion of the extent to which his mental superiority had roused fear and hatred against him in the hearts of men towards whom he was conscious of nothing but goodwill and good service. Thank you very much.
No problem at all. I'm going to read the second reading, and this is from Mrs. Warren's Profession, which, and I think it's his best play. There are other marvellous plays, but I just have a particular resonance with this one, because that's what I think, yeah. I really like the way Shaw writes for women. I would put them in the same par with Ibsen. I love the way they both write for women, but particularly I like Mrs. Warren's character. I like the whole idea of the fact that how would women at that period, Victorian times, how could they afford to send their daughter to university through education? And I just really like the idea of how hard that is. And yes, it will change a little bit. I'm not sure it's changed. So I'm going to do this a bit to Mrs. Warren. What sort of mother do you take me for? How could you keep your self-respect in such starvation and slavery? And what's a woman worth? What's a life worth without self-respect? Why am I independent and able to give my daughter a first-rate education when other women that had just as good opportunities are in the gutter? Because I always knew how to respect myself and control myself. Why is Liz looked up to in a cathedral town? The same reason. Where would we be now if we'd minded the clergyman's foolishness? Scrubbing floors for 1 6 a day and nothing to look forward to but the workhouse infirmary. Don't you be led astray by people who don't know the world, my girl. The only way for a woman to provide for herself decently is for her to be good to some man that can afford to be good to her. If she's in his own station of life, let her make him marry her. But if she's far beneath him, she can't expect it. Why should she? It wouldn't be for her own happiness. Ask any lady in London society that has daughters, and she'll tell you the same, except that I tell you straight, and she'll tell you crooked. That's all the difference. Ladies and gents, that concludes our reading.
Have we missed Paddy?
Paddy!
Oh, I think of something. Oh, really need drag me on. Not at all. It was interesting. We talked about Socrates in the Educated Woman's Guide to Socialism. Shaw said that people had to be roused to do things. People were roused so that Socrates had to take poison, that Christ was crucified, and that Joan of Arc was burnt at the stake. And each case to the clamour of those in the immediate vicinity. Now, I said I'd talk about freedom of the press. Okay, so here is Shaw on freedom of the press. For democracy to function, it is absolutely essential that we have a free press, because people get their opinions either newly fed from the paper they read or reinforced by the paper they read. Now, in my time, the press was anything but free. It cost £500,000 to have a daily London newspaper, with the result that almost all of them were owned by very rich men. And these very rich men would never allow any editor or correspondent to say anything in the columns of those papers which might in any way endanger their financial interests, which coincided, of course, with their political interests. Any editor that did that would soon find themselves removed and replaced by someone who was more amenable to the requirements of the press baron. It's worse than that. Any politician who proposed anything that might endanger the financial or political aims of the proprietors would not find their proposition discussed in the columns of the paper, or even disputed in the columns of the paper. The issue would not be discussed at all, but they would be personally vilified, traduced, day in, day out, until either the heretic repented of his heresy or he faced annihilation at the coming elections. This is the position that we're in. You could judge whether we're any better now than we were then. I'd just like to say on that, how dare we teach our children and our grandchildren that honesty is the best policy, when they and we are presented with evidence every day of the week that it clearly is not. What gets you on in this world is not honesty. It is chicanery, it is deviousness, it is traducing your enemies, it is buffoonery, it is narcissistic self-presentation, self-promotion. And no wonder it would be, because we have a system which is motivated by greed, by inequality, by divisiveness, by exploitation. How could it be otherwise? Our job is to do no less than to make the world honest. Ladies and gentlemen, we have work to do. Thank you. Earlier about how now with the legislation going through on